This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Drew Friedman. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, Andy and I have the pleasure of talking with Drew Friedman. His new book, More Heroes of the Comics, comes out this week. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but many times you can find discounts that are more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month you can check out actually several books by our guest Drew Friedman at 35% off. You can find the Even More Old Jewish Comedians. Any similarities to persons living or dead is purely coincidental. Too Soon, Celebrity Portraits, and both volumes of Heroes of the Comics. The first volume and More Heroes of the Comics, the one that we're talking with Drew about today. So you can go to DCB Service and check out those books.
That's right. Great discounts on Friedman's works and others. Check out their website, dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your Drew Friedman books there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Andy, as we mentioned in our conversation with Drew, this is something you and I have been wanting to do since we first heard him on Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal podcast.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, I've long liked Drew Friedman's work. I think I didn't mention this in the interview, but I think I was probably first exposed to it reading Spy magazine back in the 90s, I guess, when that came out, and have been following him ever since.
It's funny that you say that. I was going to mention that as well in this setup. Mm-hmm. And it was something that I thought maybe would come up in the conversation, but it never did. Yeah, my first exposure to Drew's work was in Spy. And then from there, finding out who he was, and then going back and looking some of his previous stuff, and then following him ever since. But it's interesting that both you and I had our first exposures with Spy, which, you know, used to be a fun magazine.
Yeah, I miss that magazine a lot.
Yeah. But we definitely had a great time talking with Drew, and let's go ahead and give that a listen.
We're happy to have here today Drew Friedman, known as the Vermeer of the Borscht Belt, to talk about his new book, More Heroes of the Comics. So thanks for joining us, Drew.
Great to be here with you guys.
Yeah, great to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure. And, well, we'll get this out of the way since you mentioned Vermeer of the Borscht Belt. There is actually a movie documentary being planned about me right now. Filmmaker Kevin Doherty is making a documentary about me and my work, and that's the working title, Vermeer of the Borscht Belt. So if anybody out there would like to see that movie, there is a Kickstarter campaign going on its behalf, and the way to pledge is just to type in ChicoNeededTheMoney.com. ChicoNeededTheMoney.com. And if you make a pledge to this film, you'll be able to see it, and there's a lot of great premiums being offered. I just wanted to get that out of the way at first.
I was happy to see that one of the premiums is that you can get the documentary on VHS.
Yeah, right. I think VHS is coming back. I have a feeling, and then that's going to segue to beta. But we're going to do a special VHS version. Now, for selfish reasons, I actually have a VHS machine which I still use. So whether they're going to come back or not, who can say? But it's going to be a beautiful object anyway. A VHS tape, which is new. Most people don't even know what that is. Of course, young people.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I still hang on to my VHS player because it's the only way I can watch the 2-tape set of Stanley Kubrick's Spartacus that I have that doesn't have all the extra scenes added.
Oh yeah, that's smart. That's smart. Yeah, I still have a stack of VHS. I threw out, I purged most of my collection years ago. I just got rid of them, but I saved a bunch. Especially some films never came out on DVD. One of them is The Heartbreak Kid, which was based on my dad's short story. That never came out on DVD. It only exists on VHS, so I only have a VHS copy of that.
That's a shame because that is a wonderful movie.
Yeah.
It has to do with it's tied up in weird rights. Like there's the company that produced it was called Palomar Productions, and they went out of business. And then I forget who acquired the rights to that. It's all tied up with that, which is why there's been no DVD of it. But when I mention it, people say, "Oh, the one with Ben Stiller." I said, "No. My dad had nothing to do with that one. We don't talk about that film. The one with Charles Grodin and Sybil Shepherd and Jeannie Berlin, etc."
Well, I knew we were going to get sidetracked into talking about movies, but I didn't know it would happen before.
Talking with me is all about sidetracking. You'll figure that out soon.
So the new book which comes out this week, More Heroes of the Comics, is a sequel to Heroes of the Comics. So one of the questions I wanted to start out with is that with Heroes of the Comics, most of the people you included in there were the kind of no-brainers people would expect to be in there, like Will Eisner and Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster and Bob Kane and so on. But what was the criteria then when you got to the second book for who you included?
When I did the first book, like you said, I included everybody you would expect, like Bob Kane, Will Eisner, Jack Kirby, Simon Siegel and Schuster, or all the early guys who created comics, like Max Gaines and Colonel Malcolm Warner Nicholson, who basically was the guy who published the first comics, along with those guys, like the early guys, people you would expect, the cream of the crop. So also some quirky additions to the first book as well, some unexpected people, but there were a lot of people I had to leave out, and I felt bad about that. Like a guy like a Nick Cardy, I left out, or Gene Colan, a lot of them, and that list kept growing. And then people would say to me, "Well, how come you didn't include, Bill Ward, or how come you didn't include Russ Manning?" Except stuff like that. So I started compiling a list, and then when we realized the book sold well, I had this long list. I said, well, I think I have a list long enough to create a sequel. And also to include a lot of really obscure people who most people, including a lot of comics experts, had never even heard of, although they might know their work to look at it, but they wouldn't know their names. So a lot of those people, men and women, are included in the sequel as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the things.
The sequel was tricky. I'm sorry, it was tricky because there was just a lot of information about a lot of the people I included in this book. But I had a wonderful research consultant assistant named Kevin Doherty, who is actually the same Kevin Doherty who's planning this documentary, who helped me out with this and did an amazing job.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I found, a real thrill about this second book, More Heroes of the Comics, is that the vast majority of the people, I was not familiar with, and some of the really obscure people that you include here. I mean, they're real finds, and what it does is it fleshes out the history. Now, along with this, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there may not, or there probably won't be a third Heroes of the Comics, just because you include an honorable mention section at the very end of this volume. Is that true?
Well, Derek, I these days I never say never, so I'm not ruling it out. I did include that honorable mentions because at the time when I was finishing up this book, I was kind of done with it. I'm I want to wrap it up. I want to throw these guys. I just didn't include full pages on or biographies, but I felt they should be in it. So yes, that there is 8 faces in the honorable mentions, a little black and white faces in the back, and it seems like that's the end of that. But I'm not going to say I'm not doing a third. I don't want to do a third. I don't really want to, but weirdly, or not weirdly, but that list is again continuing to grow. I left out Dorothy Woolfolk from the first book, from the second book and the first book. I left her out the second time on purpose because I wanted the book to close with Bob Wood, because he had the most notorious story of just about anybody who ever worked in the world of comics. So I thought that was a good closer. If I had included Dorothy Woolfolk, who was the first female comic book editor, she would have come after him. And I didn't want to end on that note, even though it would have been kind of an upbeat note. But I just felt Bob Wood should close out this book because, again, the most notorious, the most deranged story, in the history of comics, I think.
Yeah. Well, that leads to another question I had, and the difference between the second volume and the first from a couple of years ago, and that is with this new book, you decided to arrange all of the biographies and the portraits alphabetically, which you did not do in the first book. And I was wondering the decisions that went into how you arranged those in each volumes.
Well, that was my decision because a lot of people complain, like, well, they kind of had to search for their favorites in the first book, and just having it alphabetical makes it easier for that. Also, for two selfish reasons. I wanted it to begin with Jack Adler, who is the first guy in the book, and had a long, great career as a DC Comics, editor, artist, etc., for like 30, 40 years, and also is the cousin of Howard Stern's mother. And Howard has talked about Jack Adler over the years many times on the air. So that always stuck with me, that Howard really go out of his way to talk about his beloved Jack Adler on the air. And I've been listening to Howard Stern since he first started on the radio, and I'm a longtime fan. We're friends, and he mentions me a lot as, an artist he admires, etc. So I wanted to begin with Jack Adler. I wanted to end with Bob Wood, again, the last guy in the book. So that was the main reason we did it alphabetically. That was my reason anyway. But it also, the publishers, Gary and Eric, thought it also made sense to do it that way. Make it easier for people to find their favorites.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I did really appreciate about this book is you highlighting these unsung heroes, like Jack. You mentioned Jack Adler, but also Abe Canixon, Saul Brodsky, Ben Oda, Irish Schnapp, guys who did lettering or production that weren't often not credited, or if they showed up, readers didn't really know what their responsibilities were. And then this other kind of group that seems to be those comic creators who had really interesting stories that connected them to celebrity, other kinds of celebrity, like the Vigoda brothers and Norman Maurer, and even and then real celebrities like Mickey Spillane and Patricia Highsmith.
Yeah, so it's a mixture like that. I mean, especially enjoyed including Patricia Highsmith and Mickey Spillane because people know their names as famous novelists, but they had this early career writing for comic books when they were beginning, at least up until World War II, and then they switched gears. And the Vigoda brothers was a treat. I mean, because Abe Vigoda I drew for one of my old Jewish Comedian books, and I got to know him a bit. He came to some of our parties we had for those books at the Friars Club and at the Society of Illustrators. Really sweet guy. So I always knew Abe had this brother, Bill Vigoda, who, of course, drew for Archie Comics for 30 years, starting in the 40s. And he was an excellent artist, but he mainly worked for Archie. So I wanted to include Bill. There was nothing on him online. In fact, if you go online, you'll see there's nothing on Bill Vigoda. So I actually wrote Abe a letter, and his daughter got back in touch with me and sent me a photo. And then I had another friend, my friend John Wendler, sent me a photo of Bill Vigoda. So I had some reference finally I could include him. So researching Bill Vigoda, it mentioned that he was married to Hy Vigoda, H-Y, Hy Vigoda. I knew that didn't sound right. Hy is not a female name, H-Y. It's a male name. So sure enough, Hy Vigoda was the younger Vigoda brother, who I didn't even know existed. Hy Vigoda was a comic book writer in the 40s and into the 50s, also a magazine editor and art director. So weirdly, I've been a guest on Gilbert Gottfried's podcast a couple of times, and one of their fans, Gilbert's fans, is a young lady named Ashley Vigoda, who turned out to be Hy Vigoda's granddaughter. So Ashley Vigoda just sent me a note out of the blue saying, "Hey, I really love listening to you on Gilbert's podcast." I said, "Oh, that's great. By the way, do you have any photos of your grandfather? I'd love to include him in my upcoming book, More Heroes of the Comics." So she sent me a great photo of High getting married, his wedding photo, and I was able to use that face at least to incorporate into this image I have of him at the typewriter since he was a writer. Mm-hmm. And so I have both Vigodas in there, which is, and again, most people don't even know these guys existed, Bill Vigoda and High Vigoda. Bill Vigoda actually was more famous for years before Abe, his career took off after The Godfather and then on TV with Barney Miller. But Bill Vigoda was like the celebrity in the family, and then, was kind of eclipsed by Abe. But, there were three of them, so it's fun to have those guys in this book.
Well, I guess it's good that you have been on Gilbert Gottfried's amazing Colossal podcast a couple of times, if not just because of the Vigoda link. It's probably the reason that you're on right now, and we're talking with you. I mean, Andy and I have both been fans of your work for a long time, but it wasn't until, I don't know, maybe a little over a year ago, we had been listening to and talking about one or two episodes that you were on, especially that first one. And we were laughing our asses off. And Andy said, next time he has a book coming out, I think this is not long after, it was definitely after the first Heroes of the Comics. He said, we got to have him on the show. So that's why a number of months ago, if you recall, when your More Heroes was first announced, I jumped on it and contacted you on Facebook, said, yes, can you be on the podcast,
That's right.
Please? Because
and
those
here
are,
I am.
yes, and those are fun to listen to, really. I mean, when you said at the very beginning of this interview that going off script or going off on tangents is how things turn out, I mean, that's what we were wanting because that's what we appreciate. But listening to you, talk about, whatever, with Gilbert and Frank.
It's always comfortable to talk with people, with fellow travelers, and you guys clearly are that. And also Gilbert, who I go back with to, the 80s when we were much younger. And we were both living in the East Village, and we kind of met each other up at National Lampoon. He was doing work, I was doing work for them. This was Lampoon during the unfunny years. But we kind of hit it off because he's kind of shy, and I was kind of shy at the time. But we realized we had a love for old horror films, especially films directed by Ed Wood and featuring Bela Lugosi, and then films with Lon Chaney Jr. So I guess I talked about this on Gilbert's show or elsewhere, but Gilbert didn't have a VHS then. He's notoriously cheap then. So he used to come over to my apartment to watch my VHS tapes because I had amassed a little collection of Ed Wood films, Bela Lugosi films, Lon Chaney Jr. films, etc. So he'd come over and sit. He'd come in with his coat. I'd take his coat off him. He'd sit for an hour or two, and we watch these films in silence, basically. And then I dress him up, put his coat back on, send him home to his mother on Avenue B, on Avenue A. I was on First Avenue. So, this happened many times. In fact, my wife, Kathy, would get home from work and, she'd look in and see him watching TV and say, what's he doing here? I said, well, we're watching Plan 9 from Outer Space or Bride of the Monster. It'll be over soon. It's okay. He'll be going home. So we go way back. So whenever we talk or see each other privately or email, we just basically email about Lon Chaney Jr. or Bela Lugosi. We don't actually have actual conversation. We talk about just the same things we've always talked about. So it's comfortable.
And it's from that episode too that the Chico needed the money line that Kevin's using for.
I get that stemmed from that, yeah. So it just seems to work. It's because I remember, I'm sure you guys do, when Groucho later on, he'd be asked, well, why did you, appear in Love Happy? Well, Chico needed the money. It was always the excuse. He was a gambler, so he needed the money. So, we decided to riff on that. So Groucho, why did you fly those planes into the World Trade Center? So Chico needed the money, etc.
I'm glad you picked the absolute worst example out of the ones.
We thought, how far could we go with this?
Podcast.
How far could we? Gilbert had a few that I think even went further, just riffing on that current events at the time, which were oh my God, how could he go there? But it's that's Gilbert. He'll cross it. You draw that line and he'll cross it.
Right.
So.
One of the differences I noticed too between the two books, not just the order and so on, is it seems like in the first book you're not afraid to call out someone like Bob Kane for being an asshole, and the second book feels a little more balanced in that,
or objective,
that are like Mort Weisinger or whatever, who were notorious assholes, aren't really kind of called out in that way.
Yeah, I felt weird about doing that, but Bob Kane really, I think, deserved it. Of all those guys, I don't even call out Frederick Wortham that much in the first book. He's included. It's the book. The book, of course, is called Heroes of the Comics, and Gary Groth, the publisher at Fantagraphics, at one point suggested, when we were doing the first book, that maybe it should be called Heroes and Villains of the Comics, which I resisted. I didn't want to just label anybody in particular a villain, although, people could figure it out for themselves. But anyway, I didn't want to cast a negative light on it, so just Heroes of the Comics. But we have Bob Kane in the first book and Frederick Wortham, a few other people who were kind of sleazy in one way or another. But it was like, everybody in the first book and the second book, if the word hero, that has a kind of a wide meaning, but all of them had some kind of influence. A lot of them had a huge influence or profound influence on the early years of comics when they were, first existing in the mid-30s, when they first started happening, and then, my books cover people who entered the business during the first 20 years. It kind of cuts off 1955, with one exception, and that's James Warren, who I include in the second book. Mm-hmm. And I include him because, aside from loving his magazine so much when I was growing up, especially Creepy and Eerie, which was basically the extension of what EC was doing 10 years later. But he wrote me a series of great letters when the first book came out. He really seemed to love it and understand it and get it. And, it's just one really encouraging letter after another, which I really appreciated. And then I started thinking, I should really include him, in the second. So I'll break my rule and include him, because he began publishing in the later 50s, 57, 58. So he's in the book too, which I'm happy about. And then the flip side of him is Myron Fass, who was also a publisher, started out as an artist, became a publisher. And of course, what he published was, as you guys know, is he basically appropriated anything else that was popular and then just did his version of it. Mm-hmm. So, a cheaper, crappier version. And he had great success with that. So he's in the book as well, wearing those crazy eye goggles that he's wearing. So. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned getting reaction on the book, and I'm wondering, the vast majority of the people that you profile in both volumes, the most recent and the one from 2 years ago, the first one, have passed, but there are some that are still with us. And so I'm wondering, with the first book especially, what kind of reaction did you get from the people, the creators who were still alive, the publishers who were still alive, about the illustrations you did of them?
Okay, I'm trying to think. I didn't get that much reaction from some. I think there were only 10 people alive from the first book, including all three of the women I drew. Mm-hmm. Ramona Fraden, Mary Severin, and the one who fled I think Germany.
Lily Renee.
Lily Renee, yeah. So, and then, so most of them are gone. I heard from a couple of family members, like Martin Goodman's son, Iden Goodman, who was, very happy with the book. The main guy I heard from, obviously, was Al Jaffe, who wrote the foreword for the book, and he absolutely loved the book, and wrote me a long letter about it, and was happy with his portrait, I think. And, mm-hmm. So Al was the guy. And then a couple of the other mad guys, like Mort Drucker, as well. But again, most of the people from the first book are gone. I think from the second book, maybe 20 of them are around, but, aside from James Warren, who loved the second book, I haven't really heard from him. So unlike the Jewish Comedians book, where I did hear from a lot of those guys, I think it has to do with the ego thing, where the Jewish comedians were in show business, obviously, and just had more just want to be in your face, where a lot of these people were kind of behind the scenes during their careers to begin with, and things haven't really changed for them. They're just they did it as a job, and they went about their business. Now they're either retired. And so, if they even saw it, I'm not even sure. I know we sent it out to a couple of people. But, again, like the Jewish Comedian books, I heard from Jerry Lewis and Nicky Freeman and Freddie Roman and Larry Storch and Jerry Stiller and Carl Ballantyne and a few other ones. And they all were thrilled with it. Some of them were not. Sid Caesar called the publisher. He called Kim Thompson, the late Kim Thompson, to scream for half an hour because he was so pissed off that we outed his real name as Isaac, and Sid was really peeved about that.
Oh my God!
So it was a great moment for Kim Thompson. He was in ecstasy, even though he was being yelled at by Cincy for half an hour. And then Don Rickles wasn't happy because we outed his real name as Archibald, and he was not happy about that. He said, his agent called from Las Vegas, called me and said, like, oh, Don's very unhappy. And I said, the last thing I'd want to do is upset Don Rickles. I love him. But everything online said his name was Archibald. Maybe it was false information, but that's what I was going on. My wife and I did the research for the Jewish comedian, for the 3 Jewish comedian books. That's the only text in those books. Their real names and their show business names. Mm-hmm. And, they all changed their names except for Carl Reiner and Myron Cohen. Everybody else, and Manesha Skolnick. Everybody else changed their name. So anyway, you can't win them all.
Well, you mentioned some of the specifics about the comedians who weren't happy in terms of the name outing. What about some of those appreciations? Anything you can share from those comedians like, Jerry Lewis and others who really liked what you did?
Well, when the first Jewish comedian book came out, the publisher, Fantagraphics, sent it out to some of the comedians. I had their addresses. Okay, so let's send it out and see what we get. So I'll tell you exactly what happened. I was on my back for 2 weeks because I pulled a muscle, so I was on my back. So we still had a answering machine then. This is like 10 years ago. So we still had an answering machine in the bedroom. So after the book was sent out, a couple of days later, some phone calls started coming in. The first was Mickey Freeman, who was on the Bilko show, little blonde-haired guy on the Bilko show. He loved it. He was ecstatic. Then the next message was from Freddie Roman, who was the dean of the Friars. And he loved it. And I talked to him, and he was just delighted. And the third message that came in was, I'll tell you what it said. It said, Drew Friedman, this is Jerry Lewis. Please call me back. He left his phone number twice. So I said to my wife, Kathy, I said, oh, shit, I think Jerry's pissed off. He doesn't sound happy. I don't know. What did I do wrong? Is it because I didn't put him on the cover, or because I outed his real name as Jerome? Or I gave him this stupid expression in the drawing. So I was really nervous, but I called him back. I had to get up my nerve. I called him back. I said, hey, Jerry, so you got the book? And, yes, Drew, I got the book. I said, so what'd you think? He goes, Jesus Christ, I love it. Holy moly, what a book. I started screaming in the phone like that. And I said, can I quote you? He said, yes, quote me. So I felt very happy after that because I was really nervous because, I love Jerry Lewis and I understand why people don't love him for whatever reasons, but I love him. I love everything about him, including, the greasy hair and telethon and, but the movies and the TV shows and the Martin Lewis stuff. I love it all. And the ephemera. So, I was like relieved that he was happy with the book. I was really nervous about that one.
I was actually, that Jerry Lewis thing brought up something I wanted to ask, because one of the things I noticed in the second More Heroes of the Comics is that you mentioned the Jerry Lewis comics several times. I think when under Arnold Drake and Bob Oxner, and then I think Dan Spiegel drew the adaptation of what is it? Don't Give Up the Ship.
Yeah, which I have.
Yeah, and so that seemed to stand out. Are you a fan of the Jerry Lewis comics as well?
I guess I was when I was a kid, but it's like he was so popular then. So Jerry had a comic. First, Martin Lewis had the comic. And it's like any popular all the popular TV stars at the time had comics. They're all outdated now, but so it's like Phil Silvers had a comic. Milton Berle, I Love Lucy. Whatever was popular, but I guess Jerry was like, they kind of stretched, even Bob Hope, and as you know, they stretched those into the late 60s. So it's kind of weird to see the adventures of Bob Hope in like 1968, 69, I think was the last issue. It's kind of strange. Were there really kids like out seeking out the latest adventures of Bob Hope? But DC was still putting it out. I think that's how maybe out of touch some of those editors were. It's like, we got to get the latest issue of the adventures of Bob Hope out. In 1969 with Woodstock going on.
They're big fans of I'll Take Sweden.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad because I am too. But at least for the Anita Ekberg scene.
Yeah.
But you got to wonder about that. How out of touch these guys. I mean, you look at some of that stuff from like that era and the early 70s and stuff. Now, my interest in mainstream comics kind of ends after EC kind of goes under and the Comics Code comes in. I kind of feel, I've mentioned this, I'm not sure I mentioned this in the book, but I think things get kind of like watered down, and it's like I kind of lose interest with some exceptions, of course, like the early Marvels, the early Marvels, and Herbie and Bernie Wright's, and I have some favorite artists from that, from later on and stuff. But my interest kind of switches over to underground comics, which kind of emerge a decade later, from after EC goes under. But I kept I kept buying main DC and Marvel comics and Charlton and Archie and Dell and all that stuff. I had huge collections of it. I kept buying it and stuff, but I love Jimmy Olsen comics. They stood out for me, and it kind of influenced like the comics I was doing for heavy metal. But I kind of wonder, like, when I see something like Prez, it's like, who are these guys, like middle-aged guys, like trying to, do this stuff for like kids or for teenagers, and they're just like kind of out of touch. And, it's kind of fascinating, but, a lot of that stuff anyway.
Yeah, and, I just picked up.
No, I was done.
I just picked up the last issue of the Jerry Lewis comic recently, and it's like 1972 or something. That again, and there's no credits in it. It doesn't say who's who the writer artist is. I guess the cartoon might have been on at that time. Yeah,
the cartoon I think was started in 69-70. And it was actually when the cartoon happened, would Jerry Lewis please sit down with the voices by Paul I'm sorry, the guy who did Squiggy later on for Laverne.
Yeah, David Lander.
I think he was like 17 or 18 at the time. But that was like the most, that's basically all Jerry had going on that year was that cartoon, which he wasn't really involved with, but it was, super popular. I think it ran for 2 or 3 seasons. So I guess they segued, they basically, the comic became that TV show where they gave him a little kid sidekick or something, but I forget how it worked. But I think Mort Drucker drew for Jerry Lewis comics in the 50s, didn't he? And then later on, Neil Adams, right? Drew Jerry Lewis comics. So, it's like strange, and Mort Drucker was drawing The Fox and the Crow, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, when he was doing stuff for Mad, he was also doing Bob Hope comics and Jerry Lewis. That's interesting to me.
Yeah, and Sergio Aragonis wrote some of the Jerry Lewis comics.
Wow, yeah. I liked them because they gave him those big white sneakers. That stands out for me, those big giant sneakers. And also, they were drawing Jerry as like a 20-year-old, even though he was in his 50s. It didn't seem to matter. They were drawing him like he looked in like 1951, like some of the Martin Lewis films. But whatever. I haven't looked at those in years. I don't know if they hold up. I don't know if they were ever funny. It's like you look at what was really funny at the time, which was Mad Magazine, I suppose, and Underground Comics, and then you look at Jerry Lewis comics and Bob Hope comics. It's like what are these guys thinking?
Yeah. Now you were mentioning some of your heroes with Mad, especially. Now. It's one thing for you to do portraits of old comedians that you grew up loving, and in many cases, you've met. I would think that it'd be something else, though, in doing portraits of people in your own field, many illustrators, people that you grew up admiring and wanting to, if not emulate, then at least, get inspiration from. Did you feel in doing the 2 heroes of the comics books a little more pressure in doing those portraits than you did with the Jewish Comedians books?
Well, the Jewish Comedians books, there were 3, and what I did with them is I was drawing those guys as old, and women. As old, and the point being that these guys just, what I wanted to convey, at least with the portraits, is these people never give up. They want to still be in your face, even though their careers are, in many cases, their careers are over. Nobody's really interested, but here they are in all their glory, just like the old days. And, they're still in your face, and they're still, they still want to perform and be at the center of attention. And with the heroes of the comic books, most of those people, most of those men and women, were, like I said, behind the scenes. They weren't looking for the attention. What got the attention was the work they were doing, So Jack Kirby, created those amazing comics over, 50, 60-year career, created those universes, all that, mythology, et cetera. From his little wooden desk in the basement, that he worked at for many years. Didn't make a lot of money, of course. He got some breaks at the end, but so I wanted to convey that on the cover of the first book, that dichotomy of like the universes he was creating, and he was just basically a simple man who was doing a job. But again, like these guys they were behind the scenes. They're not like looking for attention. And I wanted to convey that with these two books. And also it's like always like been an obsession of mine to like get behind the scenes and find out who did the work rather than just celebrate the work itself. And so when I first saw Jules Feiffer's book, Great Comic Book Heroes, that had a huge impression on me when I was just a kid. Jules was a friend of my dad, so I kind of knew him when I was a kid. And so I had that book and absorbed it, and it was amazing to me to learn about like the names of the guys who created those early comics and the reproductions, which I think the photostats were actually shot by Jack Adler, which I mentioned in the book. So that kind of triggered my whole interest in that world of the behind the scenes, like who actually created in their biographies. And so, these books, my feeling is they're more visual, that I wanted to show these people in their, mainly in their environments, just at work. And, most of them, like I said, are kind of nondescript and just going about their jobs. And they could, look like a teacher or a plumber or somebody just going about their jobs. And a lot of them looked at it that way. They were just happy to have all that work, after comic books exploded in the late 30s. All these young people, mainly young artists, like had this, this outlet all of a sudden that they could, and they were just looking for new talent. So there it was. So, so that's the era that I wanted to present in these books.
Now you don't mention this in the new book, More Heroes of the Comics, but you do describe this quite a bit in this first volume in your introduction, your history with comics. And so for our listeners who want to go out and pick up More Heroes, but maybe haven't had the pleasure yet of seeing your first book, quickly tell us, how did you come to comics to the point that you wanted to honor with portraits a variety of the creators?
Well, I go back. My dad is the writer Bruce J. Friedman. He had a day job for a decade at a company called Magazine Management in Manhattan. Mm-hmm. Magazine Management is a company owned by Martin Goodman, and part of the magazine empire he ran was Marvel Comics. So, in the next office to my dad was Stan Lee. For a decade, they became good friends up at the office. Stan was as charming as he was incredibly charming. My brothers and I would go up to visit my dad at his office. I'd make a beeline for Marvel Comics, which was, Stan held court, and took a liking to me because aside from my father's career escalating at the time, and, he had best-selling books coming out, and he actually left his job there in 1966. So like in the early 60s, my brothers and I were going to visit. So I just I loved being around Stan. He was as charming as can be. And he'd just show me the ropes, and he'd give me comics, and, he'd walk me around. And especially after he heard I wanted to be an artist, he envisioned me working for him someday. It didn't quite work out that way, but, and the other perk of having a dad who worked up at a company that produced comics is my dad would bring back stacks and stacks of Marvel comics every Friday from the office, stacks of them. For my brothers and I. So by the time I was 8 or 9, I already had a huge collection of Marvel comics. And at that point, I was also into DC comics. So I had, huge collections of that stuff. I didn't even ask for it. It just like happened. It wasn't like, okay, well, that's what my dad's bringing home for me. So by the time I was again, 8 or 9, I already knew who the artists were. I knew who the writers were. I knew everything I needed to know about Spider-Man and Fantastic Four and X-Men, Avengers, Millie the model. It's just like I knew that stuff inside and out. And that, just kind of led to my interest in the world of comics. And then finally, my brother and Josh and I started doing our own comics in the late 70s. We started collaborating on different things. And that work is in some of our early books, collected in some of our early books. And that was the stipple style I was using back then, which was, thousands of little dots, which I phased that out after, I think, 20 years of doing it.
I know that's something that Gilbert Gottfried has commented on a number of times, your stipple approach.
I know where you're going with that. 2 dots. I don't think Gilbert even knows that I haven't drawn in dots for 22 years. I don't think he has an awareness of that. 2 dots. It's true. He used to follow me around National Lampoon just chanting that. Do that. Some things don't change.
No, it sounds like that. One of the things we often talk about, Derek and I do on the show and off, was that comic books, and I'm in my late 40s, but when I was a kid, comic books were just around. It wasn't like when someone asked me how you get into comics, it was like, well, my parents just assumed I was going to be reading comics because everybody was reading comics. And I think the same was true with Mad Magazine. I mean, I had a subscription to Mad when I was like 7 years old. And I look back on some of those issues and I wasn't understanding most of those jokes. And I remember writing letters to Mad that I understood the kind of structure of the jokes that were going into the letter page, but I didn't understand how to make them actually funny. So those things never happened. But that also that when I look back on movies of that era and TV shows, my understanding of those movies, the Mad parody precedes the movie for me.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I agree. When I think of the Sound of Music, I just think of Julie Andrews, drawn by Mort Drucker now, with that long neck and big chin. She looks like Stan Laurel, and so many other examples of that as well. Did they print your letter in Mad? Any of your letters?
No! Oh no! They were awful.
Okay.
And they were handwritten by a 7-year-old on
right.
like
I used to wonder
handwriting paper.
I used to wonder if they made up letters that they run. I mean, that crossed my mind. But I used to look at Mad when I was, very little. I was obsessed with it, but I didn't read it. I just looked at it, when I was younger, 5, 6, 7. I started reading it when maybe it was 8 or 9. But I just stare at it. I mean, I would read Don Martin because there was not much to read. I mean, there were hardly any words anyway. But I was mainly just, obsessed with the art and those artists, and that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be one of the idiots, one of the usual gang of idiots. That was my dream. That was my goal when I was a kid. And as I got older, it kind of I pushed that aside. It's like, it's like I want to do. My Robert Crumb became my hero. I want to do work like that, underground work and edgier stuff, and then I wanted to work for National Lampoon. I just, and then finally, when I was 35, I got a call from the editor of Mad and said, we'd love you to do a page for us. And I thought, yeah, okay, yeah, sure, whatever. And I took it, and then I became a regular contributor to Mad for 20 years after that. But it wasn't planned at that point. It was just like, oh, okay, sure, That's how that happened. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned your love of Robert Crumb, and that leads me to your comic R. Crumb and Me, which was originally a part of Monty Beauchamp's masterful Marx, Cartoonists Who Changed the World. And then it's just recently been collected in the brand new volume of Best American Comics 2016. And one of the things that struck me outside of, it being a fact it's a tribute, and you insert yourself in this story, is the fact that we get something in R. Crumb and Me that we haven't gotten from you often recently, and that is a story. And so I'm wondering I guess my question here is twofold. One, what is the genesis behind R. Crumb and Me? And then have you, in your work, become less enamored of narrative to where you're much more into portraiture now? Do you find yourself maybe wanting to do more storytelling?
Yeah, well, that comic, the origin of it is Monty Beauchamp asked me to contribute a biography to the book he was doing, Masterful Marx, biography of, and he said, would you like to do Robert Crumb? And so I thought about it. I said, well, a biography of Robert Crumb. Robert Crumb has basically exposed all his dirty laundry over the years. It's like, how are you supposed to do a biography when he's written about he's shown every facet of his life, good or bad, in countless comic strips he's done about, his childhood, his teenage years, etc. It's like, how do you, that wouldn't make sense for just me to rehash all that. The only way for me to do it is to insert myself in there because, aside from admiring his work so much, growing up and to this day, He also was very encouraging to me early on. He sent me a nice letter when I was very young, in my early 20s. He had seen my work and wrote me a great, encouraging letter, which was, like a thrill to get. And it was like a highlight of my life at that point. And then I started contributing to his magazine, Weirdo, and we became friendly, and we corresponded for years. And, we still keep in touch occasionally. And so that's what I wanted to show in that piece, Robert Crumb and me, like, for how he influenced me and how he finally became friendly. And then, just like, and then how we kept in touch over the years and run into each other here and there, and what his work meant to me. So, so that was a couple of years ago. And then, it's in the current book, Best Comics of the Year, edited by Roz Chast. I was happy it's in there. I haven't really done that many comics over the years, but yeah, that could lead to more. I'm actually working on a comic strip about Lou Jacoby right now, who was, the comedic actor.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's like, it could lead to more. I do love drawing portraits. It's like, I enjoy, I love, I've always been obsessed with faces, and, I'm comfortable drawing portraits, although I don't encourage people to ever hire me to draw their portrait, because my thinking is, why would you hire me to draw your portrait? And I get that occasionally. Like, I'd love to commission you. And I said, well, don't really like to take on private commissions, because, I don't want to, it's like, then, you have to go back and forth, and the person has to be pleased. And it's like, I just want to do my thing. I'm not out to make anybody look bad or to hurt anybody's feelings in my work. But it's like, it's just not, I discourage people from hiring me to draw their portraits. It's usually not a good idea. But yeah, again, I hope to do more comics. I enjoy that, but it is incredibly time consuming. And my main problem with doing comics is there's just not a huge outlet for it like there used to be when I was doing comics. Some with Josh in the 80s. We had Heavy Metal and National Lampoon and Weirdo, Robert Crumb's Weirdo, and Art Spiegelman and Francois Lade's Raw. And there were just so many outlets then, and now it's like, I can't even think of, like, well, where does this stuff wind up? It's like, so there's that, which I think keeps me from creating new comics work. So,
I think that there are a lot of anthologies out there, but they're smaller press, very small press, and fly under most radars. And that's unfortunate. I mean, it'd be great if we had something that was a little more high exposure, like Weirdo or Raw, but those are few and far between.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem to exist. And I asked a few people, and nobody could really come up with anything aside from, like, well, you can get it published online here and there. And it's like, well, I still want my stuff to exist on paper. I'm old fashioned, I suppose. And then, yeah, I'm aware that there's, like, some small press things that come out and stuff, and some of them are great, but how many people see that stuff? I don't know. That's just that's a little problem. That kind of prevents me from doing new work. There is a new publication called The American Bystander, which is terrific, a humor magazine. Yeah. They're running a lot of comics. I just did the cover for the new issue. I think just came out or is about to come out. That's edited by Michael Gilbert. It's terrific. It's like an extension of National Lampoon. Yeah, a lot of Lampoon artists in there, and a lot of people who've worked for the Simpsons and The Onion, etc. So that's a plug for The American Bystander. Pick it up.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's good. Getting back to Lou Jacoby for a minute. I think where he comes up the most probably for Derek and I is
I would imagine, yeah.
Everything you always wanted to know about sex.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, I mentioned Lou Jacoby because, well, I'll tell you what happened. This the cartoonist Bob Burden, wrote me. Said he was at a flea market down south where he lives, I think in Georgia. He said they were selling boxes, and a dealer had boxes and boxes of this old comedian, and he wasn't even sure of his name. He said, Lou Jacobs? I said, Lou Jacob. I said, you mean Lou Jacoby? He said, yeah, that's right, Lou Jacoby. He said he bought the stuff, and what it turns out, it was like Lou Jacoby's, like, personal items, like boxes and boxes of his archives, his photographs and scrapbooks. Huh. And reviews and playbills and it's just like, it's piles and piles of stuff. He said, "Do you want it?" I said, well, first I thought like maybe a couple of things I would take, because I have this Jewseum, comedy Jewseum in my studio with like thousands of Jewish comedian ephemera, on the walls and on shelves. I said, yeah, maybe a few things. I started thinking about it. I said, well, maybe I'll take it. I'll see what he wants for it. And, so we worked out a deal a trade thing where he commissioned me to do a piece of art. And then all of a sudden he starts sending these boxes and boxes of Lou Jacoby's personal archives. I've always been a fan of Lou Jacoby. I saw him on Broadway in Norman Is That You when I was 11 years old in 1970. And I've enjoyed him on TV. He was regular on Dean Martin show and in certain movies like, the Woody Allen film and a few others. So now I possess his personal archives. Those boxes and stacks of stuff. I went through everything. I kind of like organized everything. I have it all now. So that's what this particular piece I'm working on is about inquiring the Lou Jacoby archives, which are in my possession. I'm never going to sell it. I'm never going to put it up on eBay. I want it to stay together as one collection, and at some point I might donate it to some kind of organization. I don't know. But anyway, it's in safe hands. I don't know how it wound up in Georgia. Well, boxes and boxes. He died in New York, but his wife died before him by a couple of years. And so somehow it wound up in Bob Burden's hands, and Bob Burden got it to me. So that's what this piece will be about.
Wow. Can you tell us where the piece will appear, or is that yet to be determined?
That's what I'm not sure about. This is what is like, that's why I was inquiring, well, where should this run? I suppose, I'll show it to the New Yorker. It would be nice if it wound up in there, but, it's like probably unlikely. It's like, I don't know if there's a demand for Lou Jacoby comics, these days. How much of a demand there is, I guess I'll find out. But, of course, eventually it'll wind up in one of my books, in a future anthology, which is fine. But, it's like and there's Jewish publications like The Forward, et cetera. I mean, there's a few options, I suppose. But I put it aside for the time being. I might get back to it. What I'm working on is my next book the title is Drew Friedman's Chosen People. So it's going to be mainly portraits, mainly the portraits I've been working on for the last couple of years. A lot of them have come out as prints. So people like Johnny Cash and Frank Zappa, Schlitzie, Muddy Waters, and then several, I actually drew Dan Close recently, and I'm working on Chris Ware, and I drew Charles Burns recently. So contemporary artists I admire, so they'll be included, and a whole mix, musicians and writers and artists, and a guy who runs a deli, Ziggy Gruber, runs a great deli in Houston, Texas. He's going to be in the book. Like that. But like I said, chosen people. So that I have to make sure that the cover is not somebody Jewish, because it's not just going to be Jewish. So I'm leaning towards running the Muddy Waters portrait I did on the cover. But anyway, that book will be out next year. And I'm actually working on a portrait of Lou Jacoby that will go in that book, the color portrait of Lou, separate from the comic strip I'm planning. So
wow.
It's all Lou Jacoby all the time around here.
Wow. Well, you took a ride on the William Frawley craze. Maybe you can do the same with Lou Jacoby rebirth.
I guess. Yeah. The William Frawley was more fictional. It was like Josh wrote this great script about the after hours, like what Fred Mertz does after hours. If you're familiar with that script, some of the panels are he's an arsonist and horrible stuff that we put through. It's like that was fun to work on. But it was like early era stuff. The first comic I actually ever did was the Andy Griffith comic, which was, basically the premise was an African-American man, just innocently drives into Mayberry and then the horrific aftermath of that. And, kind of set the tone for that early work that we did. That's in my first book, which has the big Shemp Howard face on the cover. Yeah. And the title is too long for me to recite, so I'm not going to bother.
Well, now you mentioned working with your brother Josh, and you've also collaborated with your wife a number of times. I was curious. Do you find it easier or just a completely different experience, I guess? Doesn't have to be better or worse in working with a collaborator, especially in terms of comics that, tell stories, longer ones.
Yeah, well, working with Kathy, my wife, it's basically, we bounce ideas around. If she'll come up with a concept occasionally. This is back when I was doing a lot of editorial work. So, we want you to do a drawing reflecting this. So it's up to me. So we bounce ideas around. She came up with a lot of great ideas over the years, but she like kind of feel things like, if she thinks something sounds right. We have very similar kind of sense of humor and taste. So that was just like, that just really clicked right off the bat, as far as like collaborating with Kathy. And these days, when I do the portrait work, it's like, it's not really a collaboration. It's like, I'll show her something. If she thinks something's a little off, like, something looks a little off, it's like, I'll go back and work on it, just to get it right, because I trust her judgment. So it's different than working with Josh, who would basically write the script and give me the script. It wasn't really a collaboration that way. He would write, the comics strip, 3-page script, and give it to me, and I get to work on it, doing the drawing, and that was it. It wasn't really that kind of collaboration where we worked, side by side on things.
You mentioned earlier about the bad, that you don't necessarily advise someone to seek you out for their portrait, but I think it would be, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the great portrait you do in the new book of our friend Karen Green.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Well, that's an example of, I was nervous drawing it, drawing Karen. She's a good friend too. And so, she agreed to do the forward to the book. She did a great forward. I don't want to sound like Donald Trump. Terrific forward, wonderful forward. She really came through. She did an amazing forward. But so then I said, I'm going to draw you. And she was happy about that. And I said, and I want to give you the original art too. And she seemed very happy. But then, working on it, I was like nervous. Like, she is a good friend. And I don't want to upset people, especially friends. So I was a little nervous. And she finally saw it, and she loved it. She uses it as her Facebook profile.
Yeah.
Now. So I'm happy about that, because I do get nervous occasionally. Like, how's this? And I've drawn a couple of friends over the years, and occasionally, I'm not going to mention who, but one guy said, like, I really hate this. And I said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. I'll never show it. So I still haven't shown this one particular image I did of a good friend. If that friend dies, I might show it, but until that day, I'm keeping it under wraps.
That's not a wish for something to happen, by the way.
No, I would hate that to happen. But the only way that this image is ever going to be seen is, God forbid that happens.
Well, you were talking about your upcoming work for next year, Chosen People. Do you feel that you're going to be doing more work? Let's say, like in some of your older comics, where you did return to, movie, TV, pop culture, the people who time seems to have forgotten, find second life in your comics, especially those that you did with your brother Josh. Do you find yourself possibly maybe doing more of that kind of stuff in the years to come?
I kind of doubt it. It's like, I'm kind of restless, so I like to move on. I don't really like to go back. Well, in some cases I have. I drew Tor Johnson recently, a full color painting, and I still create images of Shemp Howard. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, I'm interested in like going and trying things that, that maybe are more unexpected, because, like that's like doing a third Heroes of the Comics. It's like, which I'm not ruling out, but I'm leaning against it, but I'm not ruling it out. But I'd rather, consider things that, like, oh my God, he's doing that. I don't mean like portraits of bunny rabbits or things like that, or fairies. But that's where I'm leaning more towards, because I tend to get bored and restless. So I'm trying to figure out, like, what direction I want to go. I have nothing really planned beyond this book right now. I have a couple of projects coming up. One I'm excited about, Willie Tyler and Lester. There's a documentary being made about them.
Oh, wow.
The African-American ventriloquist and Lester. So there's a documentary, and so they just hired me to do the cover art for the DVD and the film poster. So I'm excited about that.
Huh.
But I guess that's stepping backwards a bit, but it's just that the image, I don't even know what it's going to be, but that, like, I'm very excited about working on that. So, we'll see what comes on. What comes on. I have nothing really planned or scripted of what I'm going to be working on, but we'll see what happens. One project that a couple of people have said, like, well, you're going to do Heroes of the Underground comics, and I don't think I'm going to do that. I think I'm going to incorporate some of those images into my next book, the Chosen People book, because I have several Robert Crumb portraits, new portraits. I've drawn Harvey Pekar and Justin Rory Hayes. I've drawn in Spain, and S. Clay Wilson, some of those guys who I admire. They're going to be in this upcoming book, but I don't think I'm going to do a whole book of those because maybe that's too expected.
Yeah, in fact, I was wondering if in a third potential Heroes of the Comics book, you would concern yourself with the creators post 1965, let's say, and that would pose a whole other number of challenges, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's for me. That project is for me. I mean, I would be faking it if I was drawing like guys who worked for DC and Marvel in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Although a lot of people, obviously from the first two books, their careers did go into the 60s, 70s, 80s. Like John Buscema, of course, didn't become like a huge fan favorite till like the late 60s into the 70s. But he started his career, in the late 40s. And there's a few cases of that where some people, like even Steve Ditko, started in the early 50s and became a star in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And John Romita too is in the new book, and you think of him from his work from Spider-Man from the 60s, et cetera. But he started his career early on, so they're included. But I don't include guys like Neil Adams and Jim Steranko and that because they started later on. So they started like in the early 60s. So that's not really the era I'm concentrating on with these books. I'm mostly focusing on the pioneers of that business, So
it sounds like the Chosen People book could be, pieces of, of books, of like different possible books that you could have done. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Because I've considered drawing a book of musicians or a book of, underground cartoons. So it's like, it's pieces. It's like, so everything combined. So it's just going to be, a collection of more recent portraits, mainly portraits. Also some of the covers I've done for the New York Observer, like Anthony Weiner. I drew him a couple of years ago on a bearskin rug. And things like that, but nothing that's appeared in other books. It's all newer work with a couple of minor exceptions. But I did a portrait of Jeff Ross that was used in the forward to the third Jewish Comedian book. It ran small in that book. Jeff is one of my favorite comics and a friend. But so we're gonna use that portrait, but it'll be large. It'll be a full page portrait in the new book. And also Larry Gilbert, the late comedy writer, did the forward to the second Jewish Comedian book. And again, the portrait ran really small. And so we're going to use that portrait, but it's going to be much larger in the new book. And then Karen Green's portrait will also be included.
Oh, wow. Oh, cool.
And the new portrait I did of Gary Groth for their upcoming book, their 40th anniversary book that's upcoming. I drew him, and I won't describe how I drew him. But that'll be included in that book. We Told You. I think it's called We Told You So. 40th anniversary of Fantagraphics. I think it's like a 700 page book from what I understand. I haven't seen it yet, but so that portrait will be in there as well. So a mix of things. I'm hoping to have a forward by Mark Maron for the book as well.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, how many times have you been on WTF more than once?
No, just once. I was on with the episode I was on. There was another guy on named Mick Jagger.
Yeah,
musician.
Oh, that guy.
So if you just get past his interview at the beginning, I think it's 10 minutes, then you can listen to mine. But
well,
I still don't understand how that happened, but there it is.
Well, when can we expect you back on Gilbert Gottfried Show?
I'm not sure if it's going to happen because right now I have the honor of being the guest who's been on more than any other guest. I've been on 3 times now. I did my own segment early on when the show actually just started.
Right.
When the first Heroes book came out, I was a guest, and then I was on with they did their 1-year anniversary show, so it was me and Bill Persky, Tom Leopold, comedy writer Tom Leopold, Paul Schaefer, and Craig Bierko were the guests. And then last time I did a mini episode with Cliff Nesterhoff, who wrote the great book, The Comedians, of course. And so I think that might be it. I don't want to overdo it. I don't want to overstay my welcome.
Get you back on and talking about Skidoo again.
Yeah.
Anytime. Yeah, that's right. We did 2 segments. I think we did. I was on when Cliff was interviewed. I was on with him during the interview. Yeah, then we did the mini episode on Skidoo, which was fun. And they kind of sprung that on me because when Frank Santopadre said, "Hey guys, you want to talk about Skidoo?" It's like, yeah, I could talk about Skidoo, and I've seen it. But if I had known they were going to spring that on us, I would have watched it the night before or 2 nights before, just to remind myself. So I was kind of winging it during that interview. So yeah, whatever. But there's so much that stands out from that film that it's like I think we came through on it. But
yeah.
How many times can you watch Skidoo? I actually had a VHS of that for years, and I kept sending it out to people. I was trying to get rid of it. People kept sending it back to me. I couldn't get it. It was like Michael Corleone. He kept getting sucked back into the business. It's like I couldn't get rid of that VHS. I sent it to this one. It came back. I sent it to another one. But I love that film.
Yeah, in fact, I just watched it again last night. But this is probably why my wife and I will never collaborate, because she came in while I was right at the beginning, and she was like, "What is this movie? This is awful."
Yeah, well, I feel your pain. I put these movies on, and Kathy is nowhere in sight. She has no interest in watching any of that. It's like I'll put Bela Lugosi Meets a Brooklyn Gorilla on, and she doesn't want to hear it. She'll not only leave the room, but she'll go to another floor of the house. She doesn't even want to hear Sammy Petrollo screaming. And it's like, go figure.
But I mean, I did feel bad because that opening scene of Skidoo where Jackie Gleason and Carol Channing are fighting over the remote control is unbearable. It's a really hard scene to watch. The whole film is
it is hard to watch. Well, the hardest scene to watch in that film is Carol Channing's striptease. I think it's almost close to impossible to watch. But then, I have mixed feelings watching that. When you watch Groucho in there, he just seems so desperate to be funny or be in a funny film, and it's just agonizing him watching him on that remote control thing on a ship later in a film, and he's just repeating himself. It's like watching David Manners in Dracula, just screaming Mina over and over again, which is what that film becomes finally, the Dracula film. It's hard to watch. It's unbearable. End it. And I felt bad for the Groucho. Or Groucho, why did you appear in Skidoo? Oh, Chico needed the money. That's what it comes down to.
Or I don't know. Otto Preminger seemed to have berated him too into doing
he did with a lot of people he worked with. I think he did that with Gene Seberg too, notoriously early on in her career. Kind of destroyed her soul in a way. I've heard that about him. Now, weirdly, I got to meet Otto Preminger when I was a kid. When my family and I were vacationing in France, he actually became friendly with my dad. So when we were learning to swim, he had a young son there that he was also taking swimming lessons. So Otto was hanging around the pool. I didn't know who he was, but he's just an old, charming German guy, very vocal and stuff. But he seemed amusing to me. I was 6 at the time, but that's my. And then Otto Preminger's. This is how it all ties in. Otto Preminger's son Eric, whose mother was Gypsy Rose Lee. He produced The Heartbreak Kid in the early 70s, and he actually has a small part in that film as the guy serving the pecan pie at the end to Charles Grodin and Jeannie Berlin. He's the waiter in that. So that's a piece of useless trivia.
As opposed to all the useful trivia.
Exactly. This one
we've been sharing.
Discard it. Nobody will ever ask you, who's that guy who served pecan pie in that 1972 Heartbreak Kid film?
All the more reason to listen to this podcast, because you find out things like that.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah. Now, Drew, tell everyone again about the Kickstarter that you mentioned at the top of the interview.
Okay. Well, again, just to annoy people with this is for a proposed documentary about yours truly called Vermeer of the Borscht Belt. I have no stake in this film. The filmmaker is Kevin Doherty, who I've known for 20 years. He's passionate about my work, and he's been planning this film for several years. So this Kickstarter is going on till Wednesday the 12th, and it's getting a lot of nice support. So if you're interested in seeing this film or getting one of the great premiums in return, the Kickstarter pledge site is ChicoNeededTheMoney.com, ChicoNeededTheMoney.com, or Vermeer of the Borscht Belt, which is a little trickier to spell, but Vermeer of the Borscht Belt.com. But anyway, thank you for letting me plug that. And again, I'm plugging that on behalf of Kevin Doherty, who I think is going to do a terrific job with this film. This film will also include a lot of interviews with, other artists. Dan Close has already agreed to take part. And also, some media people as well, and comedians like Jeff Ross and Paul Schaefer. So it should be a fun film and mainly highlight the work I've done over the years. So hopefully that'll happen.
Well, thanks for that, and we'll include a link in the show notes as well.
Terrific.
Well, Drew, thanks again for taking the time and talking with us. And again, your new book, More Heroes of the Comics, comes out this week. Listeners should go out and get it.
Thanks, guys.
Yep,
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a blast, and as you mentioned before, this is something we had long hoped to be able to do, and I was really glad to get this opportunity. I would rank this as one of my favorite interviews that we've ever done.
Yeah, I would say the same, and I'm glad that we got him to recount some things that we had heard him talk about before, let's say on Gilbert Gottfried's Amazing Colossal podcast. His experience in getting feedback from Jerry Lewis of that first old Jewish Comedians book, and also his imitation of Groucho Marx. We could have done this whole podcast talking with him, having him recount old Hollywood stories. But we definitely wanted to talk to him about this new book and others. So
yeah,
the others.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely go out and get Drew's new book, More Heroes of the Comics. And as Andy pointed out at the top of the show, you can get that and a number of other books from Drew at great discounts at Discount Comic Book Service. The website is dcbservice.com, a great place to go for all of your funny books. And after you do get your comics there, be sure to get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to the website comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message via SpeakPipe, which is really easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Pick up the phone and dial 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed. You can check that out at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us other places on social media, such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, and on iHeartRadio. And if you're an Android user, on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
That's right. We had a great time talking with Drew, and we've got more conversations coming up before the new year, so be sure to check back for those.
Yep. Check them out.
Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.